Today we're going to go over some of the most definitive data that I have found that explains to what degree COVID vaccines protected or did not protect against all-cause mortality. So in the past, we've seen data, for example, about excess mortality. Well, this is different. This is how your vaccination status resulted in all mortality effects in a given population. The data comes from the UK. According to the authors of this article, UK might have been the only country in the world that still was collecting the data when it comes to all-cause mortality in relation to vaccination status. The data that we're going to be looking at was available from approximately, I believe it was April 2021 till May 2023. And then they stopped collecting it, and many other countries stopped collecting this type of data earlier than that. And as a consequence, we can't really tell these things. So this is some of the best data we have available remaining. To what degree did vaccines protect, or to what degree did they cause excess deaths or cause deaths in the vaccinated population? And I can tell you right away that you can make a case for and against. And this is probably why we have so many arguments and people about this topic. And as you will see, you'll be able to probably use this type of data to support your theory one way or another. So this data was a very large data set. It included approximately 92% of entire UK population, so almost everyone. I can tell you that in the time period that it was being studied, 1 million, about 150,000 people died. So about 2% of the studied population, which makes it about under 2%, which makes it basically under 1% per year. That little hair will keep sticking out, so be it. And that's normal. This is a standard when you look at how often populations die. So yes, there might have been excess mortality and so on, but this would have been all nuanced. We don't see massive deaths of one group over the other, but the data is really complicated and shows really, really interesting trends. So I'm just gonna jump into telling you about the figures that the authors made based on this data. And they divided it into age groups. And we're going to look at how many different shots compared to the unvaccinated. And they basically looked at the ratio between vaccinated versus non-vaccinated individuals. And in these data sets that we're going to be looking at, the take-home message is the following. If you see a number, data point below 1, it means the vaccinated individual was protected from all-cause mortality, meaning they had a lower risk of dying for any reason because they were vaccinated with a specific number of vaccines. And if the number was higher, they had a higher risk of dying for any reason. This is all-cause mortality data we'll be looking at than the non-vaccinated individuals. So let's get it going. My name is Dr. Mikhail Rashik of Merogenomics. Let's get started. The first group we're going to look at is the 13-year-olds, 18-year-olds to 39-year-olds. There was no kids involved in the study. And here, when you look at the graph, in yellow, you see those who had a one shot. So just one COVID shot. And you can see that overall, for the vast majority of all the time period studied, those who had one shot were at higher risk of dying for any reason than non-vaccinated individuals. It was approaching about, on average for the time period, approximately 2-fold higher risk. And this trend you will see for all of the age groups we're going to look at. Let's now look at those who had 2 COVID-19 shots. Those are shown in orange. And you can see that originally they basically those who had 2 shots and those who had 3 shots, and those are shown in red, they all are protected from all-cause mortality better than non-vaccinated individuals. It's approximately 40% better improvement in terms of reduced risk of all-cause mortality for those who had 2 shots, and approximately 55% improvement from reducing risk for dying for any reason for those who had 3 shots in comparison to non-vaccinated. Okay, we're gonna move on to the 40-year-olds. So you can see basically, you can see which age group you were in and what does it mean potentially long-term for you. So 40-year-olds, again, you see a 1 shot in yellow. Overall, if you had 1 shot, that increased your all-cause mortality about 2-fold in comparison to those who were never vaccinated. Those who had 2 shots, this is in orange, they started with a very powerful protection, about 2.5-fold reduced risk of all-cause mortality in comparison to non-vaccinated. And that same thing with the 3-fold, but that the 2-fold, those who had 2 shots, eventually, by the end of the study period, they reached the same par as non-vaccinated. So you can see that protection that lasted throughout the study period for younger group eventually starts to disappear at all the age groups, and we will see this pattern again and again. So then they become about equivalent, and you gain maybe about a 1 year's worth of protection, those who had 2 shots, and then 3 shots, those who had 3 shots, 40-year-olds, they seem to be protected throughout that time period as well, entire time period. We're going to move forward, and the 3 shots, they had really powerful protection at the beginning. On average, it was around two-fold, and it started with something like 4-fold protection. Crazy amount of protection from all-cause mortality immediately soon after someone took a shot. Okay, very, very interesting how that works. Moving forward, let's go to the 50-year-olds now. 50-year-olds, again, if you look at yellow, that's 1 shot. They had 2-fold worse time in terms of all-cause mortality. So they were twice as likely at risk of dying for any reason than non-vaccinated people. 2 shots, the ones in orange, you see a powerful protection at the beginning, about 2.5-fold protection, very powerful. But by 2022, that protection ended and they started to be worse off. Approximately 25% more risk dying of for any reason than non-vaccinated individuals. All right, so you can see, like I told you, this protection, the older you get, the faster the protection wanes. Versus those who had 3 shots, they're still protected, and they were approximately, again, 2-fold protected over the time period, but again, they started with a massive protection of 4-fold at the very beginning, immediately soon after the shots were being given to people. Absolutely stunning. Now we're going to see 4th shot for the first time. That's now shown in purple. And what's really bizarre here is that when the 4th shot was being administered to the UK population, it was horrific. You can see it started with 3-fold increase at all-cause mortality risk for those who received the 4th shot. This very highly elevated risk lasted for a few months, and after that it dropped massively by the end of 2022 and remained protecting those with 4 shots. They had 70% reduced risk of all-cause mortality, so it flip-flopped. The authors don't really explain why that is. So I was digging around, and UK at the time when the 4th shot was being administered was going through really bad heat wave. We do know that heat can affect immunological response, and it can also affect how vaccines respond, and so maybe that was contributing factor. And another thing is that there was a specific variant going around, that was the BA4 BA4, BA5, these all could have played a role. By the way, the authors did comment potentially on as to why those who had only one shot, why do they keep doing so bad in comparison? And the answer to this is the authors proposed that perhaps it leads to incomplete immunity, and it actually might elevate the risk of those who took only one shot of getting infected, and therefore that might translate to that increased risk of all-cause mortality. And the other suggestion they propose is that perhaps those individuals who took one shot, they're more prone to take risky behaviors. Hence, they also only had one shot because they were like, they didn't mind the risks in their life, right? Those are just suggestions. So these are 50-year-olds. We're gonna move to 60-year-olds now. And with 60-year-olds, those who had one shot, now you can see that risk of all-cause mortality throughout that time span increases to 2.2 fold higher risk of all-cause mortality in comparison to non-vaccinated. That's in yellow. Those who had 2 shots, that's in orange. They started with powerful 2.5-fold protection, but by the time they're getting by end of 2021, that protection disappears and they start to be worse off, and they are about approximately 40% worse off onwards than non-vaccinated. So they have a 40% increased risk of dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated. So these guys maybe gain about 8 months protection in comparison with the 2 shots, in comparison to those who, the 50-year-olds, they gain maybe approximately 9 months. And again, we'll see this trend again and again, where basically the protection wanes faster the older you are, and once it wanes, once it disappears, the negative outcomes continue to get worse. So that was 2 shots. Those who had 3 shots, they have massive protection, approximately 2.4 protection throughout 2021. And it started with mind-boggling 5-fold protection at the very beginning. So 5 times less likely to die of any reason than non-vaccinated people. Absolutely stunning data. But by the time they get to 2022, that protection wanes, and we're finally seeing that the 3 times protection vaccine drops, they become, in fact, increased risk of approximately 25% dying for any reason than non-vaccinated. And for the first time, we're finally seeing that 3 times shots protected for maybe about a year. Now, 4th shots for the 60-year-olds, we see another different trend. And what we're seeing is that they start with 2.2-fold worse off than non-vaccinated. So again, because of that maybe unfortunate timing when the 4th shot was being administered, and then by end of 2022, they become quite protected thanks to that 4th shot, about 70% or 75% reduced risk of all-cause mortality for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated. So we're gonna move on to the highest risk groups, those that had the highest risk of dying from COVID. And this is the groups that would probably benefit the most from vaccines because of the massive risk of dying if you got infected. So we're gonna look at the 70-year-olds. When it comes to one shot, this is again in yellow now. And I remember the 4th shot I was just mentioning again is in purple. So now one shot for 70-year-olds in yellow. This now translates to, over the time period that studied, 2.3-fold increased risk of dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated. When it comes to 2 shots, this is now in orange. You start with a powerful protection once again, approximately maybe 2.5 to 2-fold. But by fall of 2021, that protection disappears, and it increases actually risk of dying for these individuals by approximately 75%. So these individuals, 70-year-olds, they only receive 7 months protection as compared to 8 months protection for the 60-year-olds when it comes to 2 shots. So you can see how this quickly disappears. When it comes to 3 shots in red, the 70-year-olds, they had a powerful protection at the beginning, approximately 2-fold protection, so 2 times less likely of dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated. But again, now by the time you get to 2020, by end of 2022, this protection disappears, and 7-year-olds now have something like 60 to 65% increased risk of dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated. So once again, the 3 shots now offer them only approximately 7 months protection. And when it comes to 4 shots, the ones in purple, the 7-year-olds, apart for the first few months, overall they got long-term protection, but by the end of the study, that protection waned and started to appear to be similar. They were on par in terms of all-cause mortality to non-vaccinated. We're gonna move to now 80-year-olds. So we're getting to very elderly people, very high risk of dying from COVID infection. 80-year-olds, they had again, we're gonna look at the 1 shot in yellow. They had approximately 2.2-fold increased risk of dying if they had 1 shot in comparison to non-vaccinated. Let's move on to 2 shots in orange. They started with approximately 2-fold increased protection in comparison to non-vaccinated, so 2-fold less likely of dying from any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated. But that by fall of 2021, this disappeared, and then moving onwards, they had a 75% increased risk of dying in comparison to non-vaccinated. So they only got 6 months protection. You can see it's getting shorter and shorter, that time period of protection for them, for these shots. 3 shots in red. They started with approximately 2-fold protection, and by mid 2020, that protection disappeared, and afterwards they were at an increased risk of dying, that approximately 65% increased of dying if you, in comparison to non-vaccinated, if you had 3 shots. So these individuals had probably the lowest, the shortest protection time spent in the study for 3 shots, and that was only 5 months protection. And then for 4 shots, the 4th shot in purple, these guys had a protection that actually for most of the time they were protected, except the beginning. The protection was about with the 4 shots was about 1.5-fold higher for most of the study period. If they had 4 shots, so you can see 4 shot was necessary, it was rescuing it, but that moved to the equivalent of the vaccinated in the study period. For the 7-year-olds, I gave you wrong information. They started with 20% worse off than the non-vaccinated, and then by the end, the 4th shot was still protecting very well. By the end of 2020, it was about 40% protection. So I mixed those up. So that's 80-year-olds, and the last group is 90-year-olds. And 90-year-olds, of course, now were worse off. When they had 1 shot in yellow, about 2-fold increased risk of dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated individuals. Okay, two shots in orange. They started with about 1.5-fold protection in comparison to non-vaccinated. And then in end of 2021, that protection disappears, and they were 1.5-fold at higher increase of dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated individuals. So they had about 6 months of protection by 2 shots, 3 shots. Now in red, when they started, they had a 1.5-fold protection in comparison to non-vaccinated. But again, by early 2022, that protection disappeared, and afterwards they were at a one and a half fold increased risk of dying in comparison to non-vaccinated. So again, 3 shots only gave them approximately 6 months protection, and then 4 shots, the purple, while they didn't have as dramatic effect as what was seen with the younger age groups, especially the 50-year-olds. For most of the study period, the 4 shots were either the same as non-vaccinated or worse, and they maybe had approximately 5 months where the 4th shot was protecting them from all-cause mortality in comparison to non-vaccinated. So the take-home message here from all of this is that the shots protected, especially the elderly, from very dangerous outcomes of death, which was not the scenario for younger groups. While vaccines protected them, they just didn't have the same level of risk of obviously dying from infection as opposed to the older groups. But this protection disappeared really rapidly and increased the risk of mortality very quickly. And the only way you could rescue that is by continuous boosting. Okay, now we're gonna move to the next section of this paper where they compared all vaccinated, it didn't matter how many shots you had, versus non-vaccinated. And we're gonna look at the same age groups really quick now. Don't worry, it will not take as long as the first part I was talking about. But you will see how rapidly these very powerful vaccine protection disappears. And because of the data, you can basically predict the time point where the protection disappeared for each different age group. So we're gonna look at 18 to 39-year-olds again. And you can see anything below 1 means that vaccinated were dying less frequently. They were protected from any reason of dying in comparison to non-vaccinated. And if that number is above 1, they were at higher risk of dying. Okay, so you can see the vaccine started protecting people very well. And then in January 2023, there was that crossover for this age group, and that protection disappeared. And there was in fact an increase in mortality risk for vaccinated group. Now, I never understood why this is so obvious for this age group. When we looked at individual vaccines, this age group seemed to be very well protected. I couldn't figure it out from this paper, so I'm just gonna leave it as is. But there's another, that's a solid line, that slanted solid line. There's another line that is a dotted line, and this dotted line shows you all-cause mortality minus COVID-19 deaths. And it's higher than the slanted solid line. And this shows you that COVID-19 was quite dangerous, and vaccines were protecting well. Of course, not many people in this age group died, keep that in mind, but it's still visible. But you can see that basically this dotted line eventually meets up with this solid line, which basically means that COVID-19 risk, dying from COVID-19, disappeared. And that within about 20 months or so. And that's because the virus became milder down the road eventually. So this is what we're seeing here. So keep that in mind, because we'll see something else later on. But we're gonna move on to the next age group. Those are 40-year-olds. And you can see they vaccinated start with a really great protection, and that protection starts to wane. They didn't cross in this study period for all vaccinated that line where they start getting worse for mortality than non-vaccinated, but you can extrapolate that line. And if you extrapolate that line, that crossover would have been in September 2023. Okay, we're gonna move forward. So these guys were getting approximately 2 years worth of protection, 2.5 years worth of protection, thanks to vaccines, in terms of risk of COVID, in comparison to, say, 18 to 39-year-olds. They only get less than 2 years of worth of protection. of any risk of COVID-19 before the vaccination actually started to increase the risk of dying for any reason. But in those age groups, I'm not sure if it was worth it, because that risk of dying of COVID-19 for the general population was extremely small. We're gonna move now to 50-year-olds. 50-year-olds had the best outcomes in terms of vaccine protection. You can see the line never crosses the 0.1, which would be equivalent to having the same mortality rate as non-vaccinated. But if you extrapolate the line, their protection would have reached all the way to February 2024. So they get about 3 years worth of protection from severe COVID, from COVID death and any death. But after that time point of February 24th, it is expected that vaccines could be increasing the risk of dying for any reason. And then moving to 60-year-olds. 60-year-olds, if you extrapolate that line, I believe their point of crossover was January 2024. And basically, I'm sliding backwards. I gotta stop. Basically, they got about 2.5 years worth of protection before the vaccination started increasing their all-cause mortality in general. And then same thing for 70-year-olds, same pattern, same time point. And as 60-year-olds, we're gonna now look at 80-year-olds, and here we finally see a crossover. What does this mean? It means that this crossover happened to be, I believe it was September 2023, and at that point, the vaccinated individuals who were 80-year-old, they started to have higher mortality risk in comparison to non-vaccinated, and they got around 2 years worth of protection. And here you also see that the dotted line is parallel to the solid line, the slanted lines, and that means these individuals, their risk of dying of COVID-19 never waned. They were still at the same level of risk of dying of COVID throughout the entire time period, and that probably explains because they're so old. So even though the disease became milder for everyone else, these individuals still are at the same risk of dying. Now, next one, 90-year-olds is the last graph, and here the crossover happened to be somewhere in 2022. So they had their shortest protection, only about 1.5 years of protection in comparison to non-vaccinated. But again, they had the highest risk of dying if they got infected. So this is probably the group that had the greatest benefit of extending the lifespan as long as they continue to receive their boosters. So the authors conclude that overall, those who had 1 shot and 2 shots, overall, for the entire study population, they were at higher risk of dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated individuals. And they discussed this protection, this unusual protection that was observed at the beginning of vaccinations with 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, not 4 times, just 2 times, 3 times. And they said, this is not realistic. That's not probable that vaccine shot could give you such amazing protection from dying for any reason in comparison to non-vaccinated. And I would disagree. I think we need to be open-minded to the possibility that vaccines could have been stimulating the immune system in such a powerful manner that the immune system was working in a benefit of these people to protect from any death, because they could be, for example, help to repair tissues and so on. And we see this all-powerful effect with some of the childhood vaccines for children. So especially with the live attenuated shots, you see that live attenuated vaccines for children, they can have additional non-specific protection, meaning the vaccines can protect from other diseases besides what the child is being vaccinated for. And perhaps we're seeing something very similar here in this case as well. And we need to be open-minded. So I wouldn't disregard it the way these authors did. They actually think that the UK data was being biased in how they were collecting this information, and that overall this information might not be accurate. And I think, no, probably it could have been accurate, but we have to figure out as to why. And to me, this is why we should study these vaccines, to figure out what is it about them that could trigger such powerful protection, unfortunately for a very short period of time, and then it disappears and it actually becomes more dangerous. But could we figure out how to do just the super protective part, so we would know how to induce that component? So here you go, probably the most complicated but authoritative data that we have, how vaccines were either protecting or contributing to death in comparison to non-vaccinated. And you can see there was a massive protection that eventually got traded off for increased risk of all-cause mortality. And unfortunately, this type of data is not collected anymore, so we will not learn anymore, except perhaps in the end, some long-term studies based on vaccination status, and we'll have to see for that when that becomes available. All right, I'm finally done with this huge episode that there was no way of summarizing this easily and quickly. And please share, please like, please subscribe if you haven't already. And please check out my Patreon account, where I also do additional posts that do not make it to YouTube. And if you are sponsoring Patreon member, then you get to vote as to what makes it to the YouTube channel. And I look forward to seeing you in future installments. And bye for now, everyone.